Good afternoon, and thank you for joining this John Smith Centre Briefing Room event, the latest in our Power Hour series. Let me also extend a warm welcome to those joining us for the first time, and also to those who are listening again via SoundCloud or on our YouTube channel. The John Smith Centre exists to make the positive case for politics and public service, and we do that in three key ways. First of all, we do research, and we've recently published a trio of reports on trust with IPPR, looking at the relationships between politicians and the public. We also do it through our various internship and development programmes designed to break down the cultural and structural barriers that lots of people face accessing public life. And finally, through advocacy events like these. Our Power Hour series is designed to take a different aspect of power in each session and seek to explore it with a special guest who is excelling in their field. Recent guests have included the Resolution Foundation's Chief Executive, Torsten Bell, the Shadow Secretary of State for International Development, Preet Gill, and the SNP's Shadow Defence spokesperson, Stuart MacDonald. This afternoon, we have not one, but three stellar guests, and instead of looking at a particular job or role, we're looking at the issue of the role of TV debates in politics. And we do so ahead of the first of three US presidential TV debates, which takes place later tonight. Thank you to those of you who have sent in your questions in advance of this event. I'll put those to the panel shortly. And if you are watching this event live, you can participate at any point by tabling your questions in the Q&A section in the box at the middle of your screen. They'll come through to our moderating team, and we'll do our very best to put them to the panellists as we go through the event. Which brings us to the panel themselves. First of all, I'm delighted to welcome Katy Balls, who joins us fresh from the Spectator's own conference today. She's, of course, their deputy political editor, as well as writing regularly for The Guardian and the independent Eye newspaper. John Nicolson is, of course, the SNP Shadow Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport. And prior to entering elected politics, John was an award-winning broadcaster at the BBC and has also presented his own TV shows on LBC, ITV and Talk Radio. Our final guest is not John's cat, but Tom Hamilton, co-author of Punch and Judy Politics, an insider's guide to Prime Minister's questions, and a former special advisor to Ed Miliband, Harriet Harman and Jeremy Corbyn. So let's get started. The website 538.com have Joe Biden 7 percentage points ahead of Donald Trump with 36 days to go. Katy, can Donald Trump still win this election? And if so, what does he need to do in tonight's debate?
Well, it looks very tricky for Donald Trump, but at the same time, I do think, given the past few years of having things that we expected to happen in elections and various referendums, no one wants to go all out and say Donald Trump has no chance whatsoever. But it does look steep. And I think that when we're looking at TV debates, and I think it's obviously part of a wider discussion today, it's not necessarily what someone has to do right, so much as what the other candidate has to do wrong. I think that if you look at what Donald Trump and his team would like, that there's an effort to try and land this idea that Joe Biden is not all there. I think that if there was anything in this TV debate where Joe Biden did not seem particularly switched on, forgot quite a basic detail, I think that could be one of those moments where an attack line we're already hearing starts to galvanize because there is evidence for it. So I think that something like that could help Donald Trump. As for what Donald Trump could do, I think it gets to points where it is hard to think how Donald Trump could shock that much more. He obviously has a shock factor, but I think in a way it's quite weathered in now. So what else could that person do? I think with the New York Times story that we just had today or overnight about his tax returns, obviously there's a big question as to how that plays and how he bounces it off. We know that he's claiming it's rubbish, but how do you do that in a TV debate? Because it might be stating the obvious here, but obviously an angry tweet is quite different than nearly hour-long appearance where your opponent grinds you down. But I think the best thing possible for Donald Trump's campaign would be anything that made the attack lines against Joe Biden coming from Republicans look as though there was something more to them.
John, is it all for Joe Biden to lose tonight?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? The way in which Donald Trump has attempted to fix an idea about Joe Biden into the national mindset is the opposite of what you would normally expect people to do in terms of expectation management. Because to such a large degree, he's tried to portray Joe Biden as this bumbling, senile, incoherent old man. In some ways, if Joe Biden simply walks onto the stage and manages to string a sentence together and walk, it will be something of a consternation, I think, to folk who have got it into their minds that he doesn't have all his mental faculties. I think the thing about American politics at the moment is that it is so polarized that the vast majority of people who watch these debates have already made up their mind, really. And because Joe Biden has been in American politics for so long, people have a very fixed idea in the United States about who Joe Biden is. He's the polar opposite of Donald Trump. He's a decent guy. He's warm. He's quite loquacious. That's something he has in common with Trump. But he's an honourable person, and he pays his taxes as well. American debates in the past have resulted in some surprises. I mean, we all remember the landmark debates, the Nixon-Kennedy debate, for example, but it's often close elections where debates make a difference. Nixon-Kennedy, people who watched that on TV thought that Kennedy had won. People who listened to it on the radio thought that Nixon had won. Ford versus Carter. Ford wasn't regarded as particularly bright, and then he put his foot in it and said there was no Soviet domination of Poland, and that turned the election, some people think. The important debate that was between Clinton and George Bush Sr., if you remember, where George Bush Sr. looked at his watch, and that almost appeared to be a metaphor for a tired presidency up against a young incumbent. We saw Al Gore up against George Bush Jr., where Al Gore walked across and tried to look intimidating, and George Bush just looked up at him and kind of nodded. And it made Gore look a bit ridiculous. And I suppose the most famous one of all were the two debates, actually, with President Ronald Reagan. He'd been painted as such an extremist by the Democrats that when he came out and appeared genial up against Carter, that had a huge effect on the national debate. And then 4 years on, when people thought that he might really have dementia, as opposed to the pretend dementia claimed for Joe Biden, but he managed to make a joke about his age, that reassured America, and they felt that they could go ahead and vote for him. So debates are always worth watching, but my sense with this debate is that people have made up their mind, and it'll be an entertaining watch, but chances are Americans know which way they're voting now.
I mean, Tom, that is a pretty key point, and we're used to in the UK, with the limited experience we have of TV debates here, of the view that most people watching know how they're going to vote. Do you think there are swing voters in the States watching tomorrow night's debate, weighing up how they're going to cast their vote?
Well, there inevitably will be some, because there always are, but I think it's actually quite an important point that, I mean, I'm a bit of a debate skeptic in terms of their importance in the grand scheme of things. I think if both sides or all sides, depending on the format of the debate, are doing their job, then most TV debates will end up as a draw and will have quite limited impact on voting. And they can provide moments like some of the ones that John discussed just now, which sort of crystallize the way that the electorate is already feeling about how the election is going, how they're going to vote. But I'm not sure that those moments swing the debate in themselves. So, and partisan supporters from all sides can sort of find reasons why their side has won, and we'll talk later on, I think, about the spin room and how that gets worked through. But generally speaking, all sides ought to be getting all of their key messages out. All voters ought to be seeing, all of those messages, and then probably going with the preferences that they already had. So, most people have already decided how to vote. Those that haven't decided, they might think they're going to be influenced by the debate, but they're more likely to be influenced by both everything that's happened up to now and also the last phases of the campaign. The debate just has to happen. It's a sort of step along the way. It's properly baked into the US political tradition in a way that it isn't really in the UK, although they keep on happening in various different formats in the last 3 or 4 elections. We're sort of getting used to it. They haven't quite worked out what works best yet.
And Tom, if you were stuck in a room in a hotel somewhere with Joe Biden today and tomorrow, prepping him for the TV debate, how would you be advising him to approach the tax issue? So just for everybody's benefit, there's been a story overnight broken in a special investigation by the New York Times saying that Donald Trump's last tax return, I think, was for $750, and 10 out of the last 15 years he paid no tax at all. How should Joe Biden play an issue like that?
Well, he and his team will certainly have been spending some time trying to work out, a good line on that. Probably at what we called, when we were prepping for the TV dates that I worked in, a sort of a zinger to throw in there and be a memorable line in the debate. And I'm sure he'll have one. I'm not quite sure what it'll be. It'll be pointing out that he, Joe Biden, and all ordinary Americans do pay their taxes, and it's only people like Donald Trump who don't. We're way of dramatising that in more worked through language that I've been able to come up with off the top of my head. But it's an important, I think it's an important moment. There's a lot of discussion in the media at the moment about the idea that Donald Trump's supporters don't really care about all this stuff. That might be true, but Donald Trump's supporters are already voting for him. The question is whether the swing voters and other people can be persuaded that this is actually quite a character revealing moment that shows that he's not only that he's not like us, which everyone knows, but he's not like us in a way that reflects worse on him than it does on the rest of us. As I say, whether the debate will be the moment that forces that out into the open rather than the media in the last few days and the next few days is a different question, but I'm sure there will be a line or two in there about it.
And Kezia, can I just say, I think if I was to predict, I think the issue that most voters who are undecided may be wanting to hear the candidate's answer to is and I can't even believe that we're saying this, but will you leave office? Will you leave office if you lose? And Donald Trump is the first president in history to suggest that he might not. And I think even hardline Republicans are going to feel a slight chill when they hear that. Now, I imagine that Joe Biden's advisors are going to hope and expect that the moderators will go in on this right at the start. And I'm sure Biden's got a good answer to that, which is, I will respect American democracy. What about you, Mr. President?
Yeah, that's going to be an interesting one, because if Joe Biden does that as a challenge, John, he's in danger of looking presumptive because he's so far ahead in the polls as well. So it may be that it's a question that has to come from the moderator or from the floor. And Katy, I was just about to come to you and say we've had a number of questions coming in on the Q&A forum, and please keep tabling them. But one person's asked, what do you think is more important? Is it the performance from the presidential candidates, or is it the policies that they advocate? You mentioned earlier that it's very clear that a lot of questions will be asked about Joe Biden's age and his memory and his ability to deliver those zingers. But what are the performance things we're looking from Donald Trump tomorrow, do you think?
Yeah, well, I think that we know in America there's very high viewing figures for this, but I still think those clips, those moments, I mean, you can have a generally good performance in the space of an hour, and if there's that 15 seconds or 10 seconds where you look completely petrified or out of your depth, that's clearly the thing that's going to get thousands and thousands of retweets. I think that, and perhaps actually thinking back to the UK ones, I mean, I remember when Joe Swinson had a bit of a nightmare at the last election in the appearance, and the problem was actually the general appearance was quite uncomfortable, but I think there are lots of things that could have been clipped, and it just adds in a way like, it doesn't end anymore. Once it's over, it just lives on social media for much longer. So I think your weak moments are replayed to you more than they have been in the past. And I think in terms of policies or performance, I mean, I think that there's also a question to be had, but perhaps there's a different session on, how much difference does a manifesto make? How much difference does a policy pledge make? I mean, do people pay too much attention to it? I think policies can seem quite dry unless they're policies that directly affect you. We know there are some policies that do seem to move elections, but a lot of the time I actually think that there's something about just your sense of a person, the basic smell test. And I think that the thing that TV debates do in a way that press release or an article about a policy can't do is they give you a much clearer sense of the person, not just the carefully curated advert for their leadership, the thing that the party puts out with the nice montage music, that person when they're being challenged. So I personally think it's more about personality in these. Now it manifests itself in different ways, but I do think when you're watching the TV debates, you're getting a sense of that person, how they stand up under pressure. And there have been many moments when that have been, I suppose, campaign defining moments both in the US and the UK, because that person just has not looked as though they lived up to it. You've also got a few cases, and I slightly moving back to the UK here, and partly more because it's probably a clear reference point for me, but you know, you have had debates where people have excelled. You think back to Clegg mania, short-term mania in this country, but there is a way to do a debate and actually impress people. I think it's easier to have a campaign defining debate where something goes disastrously wrong for you than something goes incredibly right. But I think John had a really interesting point, which is, in a way, because the Donald Trump campaign has gone to such an effort to say Joe Biden is this doddery old man, you can see how actually there's probably more of a way for him to have a good performance, also a bad one, but more, you know, and where we're at than it is for Donald Trump, because people just expect him to be Donald Trump.
That is hugely interesting. John, I wanted to come to you to pick up an issue about the kind of regulation of US presidential debates, because of course they're a relatively new phenomenon in the UK. I mean, they're barely 5 years old as a format within UK politics, or a staple part of an election campaign. But we've been reporting on US elections over the years, and there's a commission in America to regulate the conduct of TV presidential debates. The Electoral Reform Society here in the UK think it's high time we had a similar degree of regulation or oversight for what happens on UK TV screens. Is that something you think the time has come for, or is it better to leave it up to the networks to decide what they do?
No, I think I'm with the electoral reform on this. I think we should do this. It works really well in the States. They are moderated very effectively. I think by our standards, we probably like the interviewers, the moderators, to be a bit more assertive than they are. I mean, it would be good to see Andrew Neil, for example, doing the Biden Trump debate. I sometimes, and I speak as somebody who sat on his sofa many times doing the totally terrifying This Week, where you've got to pretend to be very happy and comfy and relaxed late night on his red sofa. It's all very chatty, but he can turn in a nanosecond and start subjecting you to cross-examination about policy when you think you're going to talk about his dog or my cat or whatever. But no, I think it would be a good thing to have that. We know that in the UK, the incumbent never wants to have the debate on the whole, because it gives equality to the challenger. And so you've seen prime ministers over the years try to dodge these debates. And in some ways, when Gordon Brown agreed to them, it was great that he did, but it rather showed his weakness. I don't think anybody thought that Gordon Brown was going to win that election. And by agreeing to the debates, I think a lot of people thought effectively he was conceding that he wasn't the front runner at that stage. And then for somebody who was so good at debates in the House of Commons, Gordon Brown wasn't really very good in the TV debates, was he? You'll know, Kezia, he can be warm and witty in private, but he seems scowly and angry when he's on camera. And speeches that do well at the Labour Party conference, pacing up and down and shouting, don't really work in a TV studio. And he tried to get around that by saying all the time how much he agreed with Nick Clegg. Remember, he kept saying, I agree with Nick. And of course, as we know, Nick Clegg did enormously well with his popularity. I think the only person who'd ever been as popular as Nick Clegg after those debates was Winston Churchill after winning the Second World War. And then David Cameron decided that he'd go into coalition and just hoped that he might be sprinkled with a little bit of Lib Dem stardust. How long did that last for? So that's a long answer to a simple question. To a simple question, yes, I do think we should have a commission for prime ministerial debates, and I think we should make them part of the fabric of our elections, in addition to one-on-one serious long-form interviews, because I think they are very effective as well.
And we'll pick up on that particular point very soon, John, because I think that is an important thing to identify. It's not just about those head-to-head experiences. Tom, you've been there, you've been in those rooms preparing party leaders for TV debates. How much preparation goes into these events? How high are the stakes within political parties? Can you share some of your experience with us?
It really varies. And I must say, I think we probably, speaking from a Labour point of view, I think we probably overdid the prep in 2015 in the sense that it was something that we were taking very seriously, knowing that we, with Ed Miliband being less popular than David Cameron, I think there was a sense that this was something that he was potentially quite good at, and was an opportunity for him to compare himself favourably with Cameron. I think a lot of investment of time, I should say, rather than investment of money, but a lot of time was put into to preparing Ed for that, which you were part of as well, Kezia. You'll remember you were a very fine Nicola Sturgeon as part of the debate prep team. No, a genuinely impressive one in that I think you knew exactly what the lines were and you delivered them pretty effectively. And I think one of the things that you demonstrated, and this comes back a bit to what John was saying before about having a properly mandated system, a regulated system of debates, is that the UK system of multi-party democracy is actually quite different from a presidential system where by the time you get to tonight, you've got two candidates. They're the only people who can possibly win, and it makes sense to have a head-to-head debate with them. In the UK, it's very different. And in particular, in 2015, you had two people who were competing to be Prime Minister, the only two people who could realistically be Prime Minister. You had three other national political parties who were trying to compete across the country, but realistically weren't going to win. And then two nationalist parties based in different parts of the UK who were speaking to a very particular audience. And that led to a really complicated dynamic in terms of how the debate was going to go, in terms of the different audiences that each leader was trying to win. There's no point in complaining that it's unfair because it's a system that you've got. But Nicola Sturgeon could get away with only talking about Scotland because that was quite literally her job. Ed Miliband was having to speak to a UK-wide audience while not conceding to Nicola Sturgeon in terms of what she was saying about Scotland, while attacking David Cameron as forcefully as Nicola Sturgeon, and while denying that he wanted to go into power with Nicola Sturgeon all at the same time. And one of the things that led to in prep and became quite clear, so I was playing David Cameron in prep, was that my job was quite a lot easier because I could just point to the other parties and go, look at this lot all squabbling amongst themselves. If you want stable government, you've got to go with me and the Conservative Party because no one else can deliver that. And just having a debate format with 6 or 7 people in it really effectively dramatised that Conservative message, which was their key message, which wouldn't have been the case. And again, I'm not complaining that this is the way that it was, wouldn't have been the case if you had a head-to-head Ed Miliband versus David Cameron debate where the dynamics would have been very different indeed. We did have a one-to-one debate between Jeremy Corbyn and Boris Johnson in the election that's just gone, which I don't think had a great deal of impact on the election at all. If you looked at post-election polls after that, you got a roughly 50-50 split in terms of who people thought had won that debate. And maybe that's what people thought, but it's not how the election ended up going, which is one reason for my sort of broad skepticism. But in terms of how you prep it, you're recognizing that you're going to get a series of questions on a series of areas of policy, and you're going to get 1 or 2 minutes, depending on the format of the debate, 1 or 2 minutes to ask each one. So you need your leader to have about a minute on the economy, and about a minute on the health service, and about a minute on Europe, and about a minute on education, and so on. And whether you like it or not, that is not an in-depth discussion of what each party's policy program is on those issues. You're trying to move from, I understand what this question's about, to here's what my values are and how they're reflected in this, to here's probably one policy I've got in this area in a manifesto that probably has several policies in this area, to, and this is why the other side, whichever party I'm choosing to attack at this moment, this is why the other side is bad. That is a lot of material to get into one or 2 minutes. It's not very easy to do. It can be done, but it means that you get quite a superficial level of engagement with every component part of that, or you drop a bit of it, none of which is entirely satisfactory. So it's quite an artificial process in which you're trying to work out all the points you have to hit on every given area, put in a zinger if you can, put in a good soundbite if you can, something that's going to be clipped, but also just get through and survive it, work out where your opponent probably has a better line than you. In a way, it's similar to the process of preparing for Prime Minister's questions, which is something I worked on for quite a long time, except that you get even less time than you do at PMQs to develop your argument, especially in an environment where you've got 5, 6, 7 different party leaders up there. The other thing about having 5, 6, 7 party leaders up there, and this is not to cast aspersions on any of the individuals involved or any of the parties involved, is that that just gets quite boring. And it's harder for the audience to engage. If each person is getting a minute, some of them may be people that you're just not interested in. If you're a Scottish voter, you're probably just not that interested in what Plaid Cymru have to say, whether you like the leader of Plaid Cymru or not. That is not a part of the debate that's for you. And so it just gets very bitty and hard to get the audience to properly engage with, and hard to get that clash going. If everyone has to have equal say, you need to give as much time for the leader of the Green Party to respond to what the Prime Minister has to say, as you do to let the Prime Minister respond to what the leader of the opposition has to say. And it's quite difficult to get the dynamics of that right, I think.
And the other thing, Kezia, that nobody likes, sorry, I was just going to say the other thing that nobody really likes to talk about because it sounds too superficial, is on top of all this, the politicians have got to think about their body language as well. I mean, I wonder if Tom had given any thought to whether or not Ed Miliband should have joined in on the hug that the 3 women politicians had. If you remember, the Plaid leader, the First Minister of Scotland, and the Green Party leader all hugged. And the next day's papers all had these 3 cocky, strong women all hugging one another, and poor Ed Miliband just staring on from the side, not quite knowing what to do. And I remember we had a debate, because in the leadership debate down in Manchester, the producers were talking about giving a stool for Nicola Sturgeon to stand on when she was beside David Cameron. And that harks back to big negotiations between Michael Dukakis and George Bush. And Michael Dukakis was small and George Bush Sr. was tall. And George Bush conceded that Michael Dukakis could stand on a stool during that presidential debate. But my advice to Nicola Sturgeon was, don't stand on the stool that they're offering you. Stand beside David Cameron. You're wee, he's big. And visually, it will look quite good if this feisty wee Scottish politician is up against this tall, posh Englishman from Eton looking down on her. And that might look quite good visually, standing up for herself. And indeed, I think it did look quite good visually. But these are the things you're not meant to talk about in public, particularly, because, as I say, it sounds a bit superficial alongside the serious policy stuff that we're all meant to care about.
It does matter, John, so I will give Tom a chance to answer the question about whether Ed Miliband was prepared for the hug, and then I'm desperate to go to Katy to explore a few more issues. But Tom, do you remember that?
I remember the hug. I think the hug was, part of the point of the hug was that it was very much not for him.
Yes.
Had he attempted to interject himself into the hug, that would have been even worse than standing outside it. So, I mean, I think that was another example of what I was saying before, of these were 3 leaders who were fundamentally not really competing against each other in that election. One of them Scottish-based, one of them Welsh-based, and one of them with a very, very small presence, but largely an English-focused party. And so they could afford to come together in that way, in a way that the other party leaders of left and right weren't really in a position to. So it helped to dramatise that, but not in a way that was to Labour's advantage, I guess.
And there was an image of sisterhood as well, which would have been
all the more for him not to jump into it.
Yeah. Katy, just coming to you, I mean, there's been an awful lot there in Tom's contribution about the preparation for TV debates. And whilst he's not complaining, he is suggesting that there's a distinct inbuilt advantage for those parties who are chasing votes and not necessarily in a position to be prime ministerial. Can I ask you just directly, do you think Nicola Sturgeon does have an advantage in UK-wide TV debates, or does she just do very well because she's just naturally very good at them?
I think it's probably a combination. I think Nicola Sturgeon is clearly a very formidable politician. I think that she is often underestimated by some in Westminster, perhaps some currently in number 10, when she's someone who has been around so long. And I think we've seen in the sense of, if you're just looking at her general abilities, I think Nicola Sturgeon is very good at getting the tone right and communicating a message. So when you had at the last election, Jo Swinson going out for her one-on-one, this question time start arrangement, Boris Johnson and others, for some of these leaders you watch, and no matter what your political allegiance is, you're a little bit worried for them. It's not comfortable viewing because you just get the sense that they're not in control of it. Whereas I think Nicola Sturgeon, in large, she is such an experienced politician. You're never worried in that sense. I do think she does have an advantage to a degree, in the sense that she knows what her audience is, and she can just go, she can focus in on that. Whereas if you are Boris Johnson or even a Liberal Democrat leader, you were bouncing all over the place trying to work out your positions on various things. I think there's also, just as some were touching on earlier, there's always just I think that if you are the person who is the incumbent, the person who is the Prime Minister or the First Minister, there's clearly a question as to how helpful it is for you to be in a TV debate. I mean, the fact, and I think Nicola Sturgeon falls into this, but the fact that we've had successive Conservative Prime Ministers not really want to do TV debates tells you something, actually, that once you're in a position of strength, that you're already seen as the Prime Minister or the leader, there can be less of an incentive to go on these shows. Now, I don't think that Sturgeon has lent on that in the way that some Tory leaders have, but I think that the place where debates can help you the best and the most, I think, is if there are low expectations. There's low expectations, and like, you need to be moving on up. So therefore, in a way, it probably makes it a bit more impressive even that Nicola Sturgeon succeeds in these, because I think that if you look at Boris Johnson's appearances on this, it's clearly in the choice of what they choose to do, mass haggling behind the scenes to try and limit the appearances. They don't see it as an incentive when you already have power.
Katy, just staying with you for a second, I read an interview over the weekend with David Dimbleby, who was talking about the kind of health of politics and the state of public discourse. And in that, he said that what was really missing from the coverage of UK politics is that long form interview, that Andrew Neil half an hour or 45 minutes, and perhaps not just one broadcaster doing it, but there being an opportunity across the channels and networks for people to be scrutinised in that fashion. Reflecting back on the 2019 general election campaign, do you think, in retrospect, it hurt Boris Johnson at all to refuse to participate in that long form, or did he just come through it completely unscathed?
I think when you win a majority of 80, it's hard to say it really hurt someone, them not doing a piece of TV. Now, we could say it hurt them a bit in terms of perceptions, but I think in terms of what Number 10 wanted to do, in terms of Boris Johnson getting to the election day without what they thought would be a disastrous moment, I think it worked for them. I think at the time, I remember saying, is this the moment people turn? I think that if you look back to Theresa May, I think her refusal to do TV debates did actually damage her quite a lot, more than I think it damaged Boris Johnson. Because I think with Theresa May, it played into the perception people already had that she was taking this election, the 2017 snap election, she was taking it for granted. The fact that she didn't want to do TV debates wasn't so much that she perhaps was busy doing other things, it's that she already thought she had the election in the bag. Now, I don't think that was the only reason she didn't do them, but I think the reason it was so damaging her was it just added into the sense that the Tories thought they were going to get a majority of 100, and therefore Theresa May didn't need to bother. You throw in dementia tax and fox hunting, you end up with a disaster. But I think with Boris Johnson, actually his team, I think, were fairly savvy in the sense that they almost picked enough media that you couldn't say he was doing no media. No, I think they picked the media they thought would be the most sympathetic to them, or he would excel the most at. But I think that, and we could also point saying, he's done more media than the last Tory, candidate in an election. So I think that they managed to do it in a way that was less damaging, although lots of people on Twitter were very angry when he went to do the Andrew Neil interview, and I do think it hurt him a bit in some quarters. I think they played it well enough, and you can see this theme actually a little bit in how they do things now, where, I don't think Boris Johnson appeared on the Today programme once, not even in the Tory leadership contest, but he did do things like The World at One. So you can't say, oh, Boris Johnson, you've not done any radio for, because they can say, well, no, I've done this and that. So I think it was more damaging for Theresa May. I think that while it did get criticism, Boris Johnson did enough that in people's minds he was out there.
It's a trade-off, isn't it? Because there is a bad headline that comes out of saying, I'm refusing to do an interview with Andrew Neil or whoever because it makes you look like you're a bit scared. The reality is that you are a bit scared because you recognise that there are potential bad headlines that could come out of making a mess of an interview. Jeremy Corbyn, of course, didn't refuse to do an interview with Andrew Neil. He did it, and there were at least 2 really big stories in that election that came out of A, refusing to apologise for anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, and B, not being able to justify the vast amounts of money he wanted to spend on the WASPy women. Now, those are big substantive stories, one about policy and one about character, that came out of that interview. If he'd done a really good interview, those wouldn't have happened. If he'd refused to do it like Boris Johnson, then that would have been annoying for Andrew Neil and the BBC, but it would probably have been better for the Labour Party in the long run. So there's an opportunity cost to both doing an interview and not doing an interview. And the benefit of not doing one is the only headline that you can have from it is you didn't do an interview. You can get worse headlines than that.
John, is it acceptable for somebody who wants to be the Prime Minister of the country to not go on the Today programme?
No, I don't think it is. I think it's cowardly. He did not do the Today programme at all, Boris Johnson. The Tories are consistently refusing to do Channel 4 News. They're still not doing any Channel 4 News interviews at all. And as we know, they wouldn't do Andrew Neil. I mean, just a little footnote. It must be hugely embarrassing for the journalists that Boris Johnson does agree to be interviewed by, because it's virtually saying to the BBC, I'm not too scared about X, Y, or Z, but I really won't appear before the big hitter. I mean, I think politicians have a duty to be accountable to the public and to answer questions. Fine to go on GMTV or whatever, talk about what, whether you prefer boxers or Y fronts. But I think you've also got to be prepared to put yourself up there and answer the tough questions from the toughest interviewers in the country. And I think that's absolutely part and parcel of the job. And I'm deeply disappointed that we're now seeing a government that chickens out of that.
And just sticking with that theme, we've had a question in from the Q&A about whether formalising TV debates as part of the UK election system would risk further presidentialising it rather than having a parliamentary system. Are we giving the personality of our leaders, John, too much attention over policies? Should elections not be about policies rather than the character alone of leaders?
But we've always paid attention to the personality of politicians. This idea, it's a very new thing. It's nonsense. Right back to Disraeli and Gladstone, we were talking about the personality of politicians, and politicians in those days, although they weren't in their constituency every weekend, they would go to constituencies and hold huge public meetings, and they could be very vicious and people would throw things at them, and the ones that survived were the ones that were verbally dexterous and could be witty and could answer back. So I think personalities always played a role in politics. We don't have a presidential system, but nonetheless, the leaders are enormously important, aren't they? And at the last election, I mean, I talked to countless Tory MPs, well, maybe not countless, but a good few, who said to me that they really hated Boris Johnson. They didn't trust him, they didn't like him, but they thought that the party was facing an existential crisis. If you remember, they were so worried about what Nigel Farage would do to them at one point. And they thought that Boris Johnson's force of personality was what would get them through the election campaign and would allow them to win. So personality does play a big role, for better or worse, because, as you know, Boris Johnson, popular in areas of England, but absolutely toxic in Scotland. I used to just mention his name, and it was almost like a panto turn. Look behind you, I would say, at the hustings. I would mention his name because I just knew that the voters really didn't like him or what he stood for. And I would always try and force my political opponent to try and defend Boris Johnson and defend some of the things that he'd said in public. And my opponent found it very, very difficult.
Tom, I'm going to go to Katy in a second just to talk about what happens after a TV debate when you're trying to land the message over who's won and who's lost. But just before we get to that, I mean, do you accept John's argument there about policies really kind of largely being secondary to the character of our leaders? Can you think of a big moment in a recent TV debate where there's been a moment of policy that's really cut through with the electorate?
Well, I think I tend to agree with John that both are important, and the electorate has to know about both. The debate itself is just inevitably going to be about the messenger as much as the message. And that's why it matters. That's why it mattered when Theresa May chose not to put herself up, but put up a substitute. It wasn't that Amber Rudd's answers were substantially less good than Theresa May's would have been, but it's still something quite important about Theresa May that she wasn't prepared to do it. There are all sorts of ways in which we can access our political messages on both policy and the character of our leaders. Debates aren't the only ways to do it, but I wouldn't want to make a sharp distinction between this is a format that is about one and that's a format that's about another. You need to have, you know, it's the content of the answers, not just whether someone looks nice giving them. And to be fair to everyone involved in debates on all sides, the content does tend to be something that gets agonised about and thought about as much as anything else.
Katy, Tom and John both have vast experience of being behind the scenes, preparing people for taking part in TV debates. Your experience comes from really reporting on them and understanding what's been going on in those closed rooms. Can you describe to us what happens immediately after the TV cameras go off? What are the spinners and the comms directors doing and phoning you up? What are they saying? What are they trying to do at that moment in time?
So often now they have a spin room. I think it's something we've taken from America. So you, for example, with the ITV first debate in the most recent election, we were all up, I think it was in Salford, and we ultimately watched the debate in a media room, and then afterwards everyone's kind of got their laptop plugged in, or you've tried to get a socket at least, with limited success, and people are going around putting the message. And now the spin room has become such a thing. Cameras will still be on for the after programme where they're getting journalists in, and you will have a couple of MPs for every party who've come up to work the spin room. In a way, the spin room is quite absurd because all that happens in the spin room is a Tory MP tells the ITV after show that Boris Johnson definitely won it, and then a Labour MP says the Labour leader definitely won it. And then occasionally you'll have people from the press team come up to you and guess. The Labour person from the press team tells you how good the Labour leader was, and vice versa, the Tory press person tells you how good the Tory leader was. So I'm slightly sceptical of the point of spin rooms, but they do often have complimentary food and drink, and it's better to be in the thick of it, in the sense. I think it's better to be on site where the debates are, because you do pick up things. I don't think you pick up the things they want you to tell you. I think you can pick things up from the body language of the groups going around, how long people bother staying in the room talking to journalists. I think those that want a quick exit, normally you can read from that perhaps actually they're re-strategizing because didn't quite go to plan, but I think it's become very performative. So you have the after, so you will have the people trying to kind of give you the lines and also doing it on camera. Quite fun sometimes they just have a fight with each other after the two sides, but I think probably in terms of when you're a journalist trying to assess what's happened in it, I do think one thing is there's often a snap instant poll, and everyone definitely keeps an eye on that, because whereas no one's hugely surprised with what a Labour MP or a Tory MP or an SNP has to say about debate, that often gives you a sense of where a survey group are, and I think that can be quite interesting. And that's probably the thing, if you've got a thought on who you think did best, often you want to just check and make sure you don't just completely miss something in the moment. And I think that's probably the thing that I look to most after watching one.
John, I'm guessing you've probably had attempts to be spun put on you as well as doing some spinning in the past. Can you share some of your own experience of this?
Yes, I absolutely agree. I really don't think the spin rooms work at all, because they're just ridiculous. It's ridiculous for somebody to come up from the Labour Party and tell you that that their candidate is the bee's knees or the SNP person or anything else. What you want them to do is to tell you the truth. Actually, we talked about Andrew Neil earlier on, and I once asked his producer why he had me on his late night shows so much. And it was the nicest thing he said. He said, well, Andrew really likes the fact that you always answer his questions. And when you don't know things, you say, I don't know. I remember at one point him asking me a question about some kind of detail about Scottish government policy. And I was down in Westminster, and he said, do you not know the answer to this? And I said, no, I don't. And he said, why not? I said, well, because obviously you're sitting there with all your questions pre-prepared and all your answers pre-prepared and all the information at your fingertips. You want me to know everything that's going on in Westminster, my own brief in detail, overall what's happening at Holyrood as well. And you're asking me a specific, very detailed policy about education or something. Well, I said, I'm human. I can't know everything. And he said, well, fair enough, and moved on. I think, really, I think that Katy was absolutely right when she said the most interesting thing about the spin rooms is when you see the journalists talking to one another and forming a view of how they think it went. And when you see politicians exchanging glances when they don't know that they're being watched necessarily, and you see the nervous flicker or the strained smile, I think it's those kind of things that are interesting, rather than the line they try and spin you, which is totally predictable.
It's back to your earlier point about body language and the sort of silent communication that goes on in these environments.
Yes, I think it is. And we were talking about Bill Clinton earlier on. And when I prepared Alex Salmond for the second of the independence debates against Alistair Darling, Alistair Darling, I think, had been very much underestimated in the first of those debates and had performed much better than was expected. Let's call a spade a spade. I think most people thought that he won the first debate, and then I was asked to help with the second debate. And I remember saying to Alex Salmond, it's a difficult thing for a politician. We're in the Kelvin Grove Hall, and it's a difficult thing if you're in front of a live audience to keep looking ahead and not to move your neck, because you want to talk to the people in the hall, because that seems courteous. But in TV debates like that, the audience is one person sitting at home in the sitting room, and you've got to stare at that camera, that little red light, which may be 100 meters away at the far end of Kelvin Grove. And I said, opening and closing statements, just look at the people at home. Don't turn from side to side, because to the person at home, that looks shifty. You want to engage your eye line. And during the debate, come out from behind the lectern, which is what Bill Clinton did. I remember that famous debate where he went up and he said, what's your name? And he said, I'm the governor of a small state, Arkansas, and chances are when somebody loses his or her job, if I don't know them, I'm going to know members of their family or their extended family or their friends. And it seemed human, and it seemed real and engaged and sincere. And Bill Clinton did like people. And so it wasn't insincere, it was sincere. And it was very effective. And I remember saying to Alex Salmond, I think you would be good at this in a way that Alistair Darling wouldn't. So come out from behind the lectern and walk forward and talk to people in the audience and engage with them during the debate. And he did that. And I think it was very effective, because Alex Salmond, people forget now, because there's travails, but at his height, he was a formidable politician with a great capacity to engage with the public and talk to the public. I used to watch him work in crowds, and it was an impressive sight.
Tom, this point about sincerity, we've had a couple of people table questions saying, does live debate really matter as much as who can get the best sound bites out on social media afterwards? And another comment saying, is talking in sound bites really the future of politics? I mean, sound bites, if you can identify them, are by their very nature insincere. Why does so much work go into crafting that perfect sentence? Or can they be of the moment? Are they always pre-planned?
They're not always pre-planned. I think sometimes they really can come to someone in the moment. That always feels very risky, but it's something that's, if you think of a good line, you can throw it in. But a lot of them are pre-planned. I mean, asking if it's the future of politics, it might well be, but it's the past of politics for several decades now as well. So let's not overdo the idea that this is a particularly new innovation. People have always wanted to have good lines that sum up one's own position or one's opponent's in a memorable sort of soundbite, and they're worth getting into, because if you've got a debate that's an hour long and it's going to get covered, some people will watch it live, but a lot of people will just hear roundups of it on the TV or radio news the next day, and they'll only have 2 or 3 minutes of reporting on it, of which each candidate will get 30 seconds or so, and it's going to be the best lines. If all you're doing is saying something boring at length in a quite inarticulate way, it's not only not going to appeal to anyone listening at the time, it's also going to be impossible for the TV producers to clip it later. So of course you've got to get that right. In general, it is just a good discipline for politicians to be able to express themselves succinctly and memorably as often as they can. And I don't think, you can be cynical about that, but it is part of the job to put your political case across in the most persuasive way possible, and that will include being brief, as I just wasn't.
Katy, sound bites, are they always going to be a thing? Is Twitter now just one big series of sound bites for party activists to push their party message? Is social media enhancing our political discourse?
I mean, I don't know in sound bites, because I think they can fall into a few things. I think social media, it just is suited best to kind of the moments which probably aren't people's best moments. So if there's a gaffe, I think that's where social media is. I think that actually these pre-planned soundbites, the thing is, we all laugh at them. We all say they're awful, like long-term economic plan. But then at the end of the day, I feel like the success of a soundbite is when you say a party as someone thinks of it. So I don't think anyone particularly likes soundbites, but I think that Strong and Stable clearly backfired for Theresa May. But had the campaign gone smoothly, I think saying something repeatedly, and clearly I think the debate can be an important way to do that, it can be quite important, because it just does land a general message. Soundbites don't tend to be the thing you're most excited about at a party, but I think there is something about how the Tory party are often associated with fiscal competence, or at least in the past have been, and the soundbites they have gone with. So I think that they can be fairly effective. I think as for social media and what it does to political debate, I think that we're probably deluding ourselves slightly if we're saying politics has never been vicious previously, but I definitely think it can exacerbate it in a sense. And I think the fact now, when you're watching things like TV debates, and you see it on Question Time too, it does seem like there's a lot of people, or a section of people who are interested in these programs, kind of watch it just to tweet sometimes witty, sometimes less witty, criticism of the people on it. And I think that's a new element to our political discourse. There are different ways you did it previously, and I think that can be more intense. And while it's always it should always be a positive to have more people interested and engaged, I think social media does help with, there's also a negative if it feeds into this environment where people feel like they're being torn down quite a lot more.
And Kezia, I think it's important that when you deliver the sound bites, if you're prepared to accept a sound bite from whichever Svengali has written it for you, and I've never been asked to repeat any sound bite by anybody, and I would refuse to do so. But it's very important you don't sound like a Stepford wife or a Stepford husband. And that, of course, was the problem with Strong and Stable and Coalition of Chaos, because Tory politicians would often try and shoehorn both of them into a sentence, even if they were being asked, what their favourite cake was during the course of that campaign. And it just made them sound robotic and absolutely ridiculous. Where sound bites can be useful, I think, is if they focus attention on what people perhaps are already thinking about you or your opponent. We think of Walter Mondale's Where's the Beef with Gary Hart, who was seen to be all spin and no substance. Or There You Go Again with Ronald Reagan against Jimmy Carter, who seemed to be kind of moany and complainy. You're no Jack Kennedy, Lloyd Benson said when he was up against Dan Quayle. The other sound bites, I think, will maybe in the longer term come back to bite the politician. I wonder if Oven Ready Deal has now begun to assume a position of complete absurdity and ridiculousness in the lexicon of political debate, because it was so manifestly not true, and it sort of spoke and will speak to a kind of slipperiness about Boris Johnson that we've all come to recognise.
And John, just sticking with you on social media, do you think a tweet has ever changed a mind?
Oh, that's a good question. Tweets have certainly been pretty devastatingly destructive to some people's careers, haven't they? Where people have tweeted in an inappropriate way. I'm sure a lot of people haven't got the promotions that they might have they might have wanted because of their presence on social media and a sort of impression, perhaps, that their whips or their party bosses have, that they can't quite be trusted, that they will say things that are intemperate. But as against that, and we've got to remember that Twitter is a little microcosm that most people ignore. You do sometimes get a sense of politicians, don't you, from Twitter? I mean, with Nicola Sturgeon, for example, there's no doubt she's passionate about books. I mean, nobody thinks that Nicola Sturgeon is going home at night and she's a party animal. Her social media account just sort of radiates hard work followed by reading. That seems to be her life, doesn't it? So I don't know. I think all of us have responsibility on Twitter in particular to try and be to try and use it well and to be kind, not to join pile-ins, not to be intemperate, and to remember it can be a great forum for communication, but it can also be a terrible forum for bullying. And I see that in particular with women politicians who are subjected to the most appalling, revolting abuse on Twitter, which leads us to a whole different discussion. But my role as DCMS spokesperson and on the select committee, I do want the social media companies to be much tougher on abuse, and I want the government to be much tougher on social media companies who do not control abuse.
I think we can all agree on that. And Amnesty International have actually published a report this weekend looking at toxic Twitter once again. We're shortly about to close what's been a fantastic 60 minutes, folks. But just before we do that, if I can ask our panelists just to offer us up to a minute really on, if TV debates don't change minds, heads and hearts, what does in politics? What would your advice be to the politicians or elected members of the future about how they should conduct themselves if they're in the business of persuasion? And Tom, I'm going to start with you and then work my way along, ending with you.
Well, I think what persuades people is a much longer term project than anything that can happen in a debate. And the debate may well be part of that, but it can't come out of a clear blue sky. It has to be it has to be consistent with what people already believe about what a politician is doing. So the time between a politician becoming leader of a party and eventually leading that party into an election is one in which they have to build a narrative, build a policy platform, and get the public to understand who they are and where they're coming from. And all of that has to come together to persuade people that they are someone worth voting for. And it doesn't come in individual flashes or moments or debates. It comes over a long grind of just doing hard political work. And it's not as much fun or interesting as sitting down for an hour watching a debate, but that's just how it has to go.
John, it's a long grind, the art of persuasion.
Yeah, but it can be enormous fun as well, can't it? Whether or not you're debating fellow politicians, answering journalist questions, or just on the door talking to folk, it can be great fun. I think it's important to have a hinterland in politics, to do other things. I think it's very important to friends who can make fun of you as well, so that you don't take yourself too seriously. I think that's very healthy, and goodness knows I have plenty of friends who fall into that category. I think it's very important to be respectful in politics. Quite good to friends across the political spectrum as well. I think it's important to listen, and this is one for activists. I think it's very important not to isolate yourself in a bubble where you only preach to the choir, because a lot of people think everybody agrees with me. No, they don't. It's because you're only talking to people who agree with you. Go out there, meet the public, talk to other people, and try and win them round with rational arguments and courtesy and respect and listening. That's really, there's nothing more important in politics than listening.
And Katy, the final word to you. What changes minds from a journalist perspective?
I think going back to what Tom was saying, it's just a very long path, isn't it? I think we're seeing it now with Keir Starmer. Okay, I think Keir Starmer's done a very good job in his first few months of almost undoing some of the views there were of Labour before, trying to suggest it is a new leadership. But I think he has not yet done the job of trying to suggest who he really is to the public. I think that he does have a successful attack line though on the government in terms of incompetence, because it's just this slow build. So it's hard to predict where we're going to be in a couple of years' time, but you can see how slowly but surely the government will, you know, is having that. It's harder for the government, this idea of, you know, long incompetence, over-promising and under-delivering. And I think attack lines, actually, immediate attack lines, I think they need longer to land. So I think that's why with TV debates, they can confirm what you already know. They might make you think twice about something. But I think the most effective attack lines are ones that slowly over time, over a few years, come to be so closely associated. So I think that ultimately, if you're working a way to knock the other party down, it needs to be not just something, you know, for an hour's television or even like a month of debate season. It has to be longer lasting. And I don't know if the Tories have quite worked out their attack line on Labour yet, but to me it seems that Labour have worked out their attack line on the Tories. So, you know, is Keir Starmer remain a lawyer? Is it being a lawyer a bad thing? There's lots of questions there. So I think long-term attack lines, but I do think that if we're talking about short-term things, I think that is more for a party or a politician to fail than it is for them to gain. So I don't think we can, although I was saying earlier, not everyone pays attention to policy, I think you can undo a lot of slow, you know, hard-won work with a disastrous policy. And actually, like the slow good work, the good work normally takes a long build. I think that it only takes, you know, one or two bad mistakes to really damage how you are perceived. So I suppose it's a slightly long-winded answer, but I think that you need to spend a long time working out your general plan, but you not thinking about something and a quick mistake can cost you a lot, and that can happen within 5 minutes.
Katy, thank you. John, Tom, it's been a wonderful 60 minutes, hugely insightful and so interesting. For all those people who've been watching, the minute that you click off of this Zoom event, you'll have the opportunity to tell us what you thought of it, as well as an opportunity to suggest future speakers for John Smith Centre Power Hour events. So if you'd like to catch up with previous events, they're all available on the John Smith Centre website under our resources section. And the next event is on the 6th of October at 7 p.m. with Anna Soubry, the former Conservative Defence Minister and Change UK MP, and we'll be talking that night about how politicians handle it when they fall out with their political party. So that'll be one not to miss. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time. Bye for now.